Hello everyone, welcome to Of God in Mind. Today I'm going to be doing a bit of a rebuttal to an article that I've seen crop up in a few places. Those of you who've been following the news lately might have seen that Margaret Court made some unpopular statements about homosexuality. And I'm not really here to discuss that, but I'm here to discuss this article that appeared in ABC News about the Bible isn't meant to be read that literally. It says some things right, but it's got a lot of things wrong in it, and I'll be going through both. So we start out pretty well here, like down to here. Reading the Bible to determine the shape of contemporary marriage is not an easy task. Ancient collection of books, spanning over 1,000 years, and especially it was written. Much of the Bible was written 2,500 years ago when family life was very different. This is all very true. But now we start getting into some of the trickier stuff. So, Abraham fathered children with his concubine as well as his wife, and Moses had 2 wives, one of whom is presented as problematic because she was a foreigner. See, this is true, but its usage here is not amazing. So those of you who've read parts of the Bible before, especially Judges is a big one for this, you'll know that there's more in the Bible than... The Bible presents some stuff without always giving direct commentary on it. So the Judges is full of this. It's a book of terrible things happening, terrible things being done, and God doesn't have a lot to say about any of it. But this isn't there to give us an example of what to do. It's there to give us an example of what not to do, of what people are capable of things that happen when, as in Judges, the nation turns its back on God and decides it wants to follow its own knowledge. Doing what is right in their own eyes is kind of a key phrase of Judges, and that's sort of what we see here. I did a study a while back on going through looking at all the families of the Old Testament and seeing how they were presented and how the results turned out in them. And of those, you see there is a bunch of polygamous marriages with two or more wives, concubines, stuff like that, but none of this stuff worked out. None of this stuff was shown to be functioning well, shown to be good for people, barring, like, I think there was one exception, which was kind of a random old couple that David meets in his travels. Those guys, at least from what we were shown, seemed to be working out pretty okay. But generally, it was a big thing with David. It was that lots of terrible things happened because of it, including the whole thing with Bathsheba. Solomon, it was considered one of the main aspects of his downfall that he had so many wives and so few of them even followed God. Abraham, if you've read through Genesis and the story of Abraham, you'll know how much conflict there was in his family between the concubine and his wife. And it was her idea originally for him to have a child by the concubine, and that ended with them having to be sent away and God looking out for them as they went away. And similar sort of thing with Moses, and it sort of appeals to our modern sensibilities here, one of whom is presented as problematic because she was a foreigner. There's a lot more subtlety to that when you read it in the Bible than how it's presented here. The trouble is not really that she's a foreigner. For example, Ruth is a foreigner and she's presented very well. The trouble is that she didn't follow God, her worldview, or she might have followed God, and I don't think we actually get commentary from Moses or from God around his wife, his first wife, that calls her problematic for that. It's quite likely she did adapt the Israelite God. And also, this is Moses we're talking about, who brought a mixed multitude out of Egypt. People from all nations who were willing to follow God and follow him to the promised land in Israel. So it's kind of painting a picture there that I don't think is fair. Also, this polygamy is common, true. as was use of slaves as sexual concubines. This is not really true. This was not terribly true in many of the Mediterranean cultures. Sure, it was present. For example, slaves often had no rights, even against things such as rape or use by the master for sex and so forth. But that doesn't mean it was common. And especially in Israel, it was very much not allowed. And the example we have with Abraham is sort of an exception to that, and that's a very old example. Abraham sort of happened around the 1000 BC, and he came from Babylon, which was a culture where it had laws. You'll see in the law code of Hammurabi that this was allowed. If a wife can't produce an heir for her husband, then they can then he can have sex with a concubine, and they can decide to have that child. They can use the concubine as sort of a surrogate mother in a very crude, primitive way to get an heir for his household and for that family, to continue that family line. So this to say that it was common, and especially emotive language like this, very unfair. Also, now we get to this line. Hopefully a lot of you can identify that this is not really true to begin with. Jesus said nothing about homosexual relationships or marriage except that people should not divorce. There's elements of truth to this. And of course my screen doesn't work. Why does it do this? But in in Matthew 19:3-7, it says some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason?" There we are, got it working. For any and every reason. Jesus replies, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Whatever God has joined together, let no one separate." Now there's some truth in what's said here, that this is a teaching about divorce, but this is also, you've got a lot in here that is very much for traditional marriage. So it is between God made them male and female. A man will leave his father and be united to his wife. These are very specifically gendered words. So the two we have here, in Greek, arsen and thele, something like that. Male and female. They're even more specific than the sort of ones you might be more familiar with, such as andros and gyneke. These are sort of specifically biological male and female. Not that word. Arsen, its word root sort of comes from stronger, the lifting sex, and thele is from a word root meaning breast, nursing at the breast. Very much concerned with biological sex here, and not even social roles. So, true, this is about divorce, but false, this is also in a lot of ways confirming male and female marriage, and not whatever we want to define it as. Now to the next section. This is all quite true, by the way. That his concern is in speaking against divorce because it left the women in a very bad place. This is a time well before social security for anyone, man or woman, and a woman who was divorced had no real way to support herself. She'd have no inheritance, very unlikely to have land, and often couldn't even earn their own money, didn't really have the equipment to do a craft, and was often forced to be beggars or prostitutes. And we see a bit of this in the book of Ruth as well, where we see that Ruth has to, after her husband died for her and Naomi, they have to essentially beg. She goes around to the farms, gets what they can, gathers from the edges of the field. And that was what had to happen with widows. That's why they're very often mentioned alongside the poor and so forth in the Bible, because they are a very vulnerable group of people. And I don't really want to get into this too much. Paul thinks celibacy is preferable for a Christian. That's been covered in a lot. Like, that's true to a degree. He also thinks marriage is a good thing, so forth. There's a lot of nuance to that and so forth that you can find information on elsewhere if you're curious about that one. It's a pretty long discussion. But their intention in using it here is that basically the author wants us to not take the Bible literally. So Paul thinks celibacy is the best, so therefore we should all be celibate. But you should know from comparing other parts of the Bible, looking at the context Paul is speaking and stuff like that, that's not true. Like just before he talks about the celibacy thing, he's talking about how marriage is a good thing, and if you can't be single, get married and do it quickly, essentially. So this kind of Christian teaching led, if any... Oh, it's weird when they put quote marks in. But this is true as well, that he breaks down in this teaching racial barriers, class barriers, and even gender barriers, breaking down sort of traditional and, for lack of a better word, patriarchal structures as well. But there's also parts where that is reinforced. So it's sort of cultural teaching, and it's kind of like the gist of the teaching in a lot of Paul's arguments like this is sort of like the idol, meat sacrifice to idols one. We don't really need to do this. God doesn't consider these differences, but often we live in a culture where this stuff is part of it, and sometimes you just go with it. If there's no major disagreement, and if it will be, if it's not a stumbling block to you, but it could be to others, go with it. Do whatever, like Paul's teaching, I became a Jew to the Jews, I became a Gentile to the Gentiles. Like, take on whatever manner of life you can to reach out to the people in the communities you're in, essentially. So this, sort of true, except we're talking a lot later than Bible times, remaining celibate and living in a nunnery or a monastery. We're talking, these only started to get real big sort of around the 500s, I think, but they'd started earlier in late Roman times, once Constantine made the empire Christian and so forth. And often it wasn't as much of a choice as this puts out, radical, attractive and liberating alternative to arranged marriage. Often, yes, women could volunteer to go in nunneries and so forth, but a lot of them were kind of placed there due to family and politics and so forth. So, elements of truth to that, also elements of not quite. This, very wrong. Jesus' own mother, who's an example of faith in the church's tradition, appears to have left her husband and other children at home to follow her itinerant son. Not true. The only time we really see Mary, apart from in Jerusalem at sort of the end of Jesus' crucifixion, is with Jesus' brothers and sisters in Galilee. And it's true that Joseph does vanish from the picture, which is what they're getting at here. He's mentioned in the start of the Gospels, and then he just vanishes. There's no mention of him. There's no mention of what happened to him. But to assume that that's because Jesus' mother has left him and is following Jesus around without their other sons, and indeed a lot of her children, so at least James followed, who's called brother of Jesus, followed Jesus around. So it's not as if they were all at home. But anyway, back to the point I was making. Far more likely is that Joseph died. These were brutal times. He was, like, average age is something like 30. because such high fatality rates just from various things, from injuries, from work, such things. He was a carpenter, that's a bit more physical, can have stuff collapse on you, all manner of incidents can happen. Perhaps he was even a fair bit older himself. It's likely he was around sort of 20, like mid-20s to 30s when he married Mary, Jesus' mother. And so by the time Jesus is doing his ministry, when he's in his 20s and 30s, Joseph would be at around 50s, which is a very good age back in those days. For him to have died is far more likely than this. It was very hard for a woman to leave her husband, and as pointed out above, being a widow is very hard, and it's very unlikely that Jesus' mother would put that life on herself. So they're kind of looking at the scant evidence we have and producing zebras and not horses. If you know that sort of old saying, if you hear hoofbeats, then assume horses, don't assume zebras. It's just, the evidence is far more in favor of Joseph having died than having this happen. So, got nothing to say here. I'd honestly never heard of her before this happened. So, doesn't really matter. That's a whole other that's a whole other video in itself. The gender roles and so forth in 1 Timothy. Personally, I think a lot of that is tied up in that sort of cultural relatability I put above. It's a lot more about avoiding various things and fitting in with a culture to reach to them, because Timothy is essentially a handbook to a church, a specific church that we don't really know, or a specific group of churches. So again, it's just kind of there for shock value, really, without any care of what it's there for. Also, this is very much not true. Why biblical scholars and mainstream Christian churches do not adhere to a literal interpretation of this ancient and diverse text. Sure, some biblical scholars and mainstream churches don't. They're definitely the minority, and they're often, from my perspective, very questionable. So, yeah, another sort of deliberate misleading falsehood in this article. More stuff about Court herself. This, well, not really this sentence, but I'll get into this in a minute. But this stuff, actually it goes into it here. This stuff is all actually very true. And honestly, she should have focused a lot more on this than making sweeping statements and untrue statements about the Bible. Because the culture of the Bible was written in, there was no equivalent to mutual LGBTIQ, whatever, relationships that we have. It's like, for example, the old Roman or Greek way. It was a grown man, like a middle-aged man, and a prepubescent, well, not prepubescent, but like a young teenage boy. There was sort of a, that's what your homosexuality consisted of. It was not a mutual, well, it wasn't a, it's probably safe to say it wasn't very mutual at all. It was an expected thing in the culture, and it was acted like a sort of mentoring, and was pretty terrible, really. So that the fact that the Bible condemns actions like that are essentially modern pedophilia, actions, same-sex actions that are often rape, they're often adulterous because these were often married men as well, imbalanced power dynamics. Like in the Roman world, it was literally forbidden to have homosexual relationships within the same social class. This is all very true, and that's, when the Bible mentions homosexuality, that is what it's talking about essentially. That is what was in the culture at the time, and that was sort of their context of it. There was no context of their sort of modern homosexual marriage thing. So it's a little hard to work out from that, okay, what do we do with this new modern thing? I'd argue that there is very good evidence that it's still considered wrong. Like we went through what Jesus said up in Matthew 4 earlier. That's pretty good understanding that the preferred way, the ideal way, is one man, one woman, and together for life. But obviously we don't see that in the world, and even the Bible doesn't show that in the world, as it points out above. Like, you can probably even read some things in the fact that it wasn't, while it was spoken against and taught against, like it's in the law, marry one woman, no polygamy, make sure she's a believer, stuff like that. But it wasn't followed, and it also failed as it wasn't followed, is what the Bible shows, but it wasn't explicitly condemned for it. And I think that maintaining a bit of that is a good way that we Christians can go about this now. Sure, this stuff happens, it's not the best way to do things, but it's not as if all male-female relationships are the best way to do things either. Often they're abusive, they need to break down, there's lots of terrible ways that even a male and female relationship can be terribly wrong, and in a lot of ways way worse and more abhorrent than a sort of loving homosexual relationship with children and so forth. Like maybe it's better for a child who has no parents to have a homosexual couple as their parents rather than continuing to have no parents. It's complicated things like this in practice. Like, sure, the ideal, male and female for life, but we're not in that ideal, and we might have to learn how to adapt, how to apply the biblical concepts throughout it, that are throughout the Bible, in that just as God remained silent on, not silent, just as God didn't march down the streets and order that everyone break off their polygamous marriages and so forth. You realize that there's more at stake and there's more important things than what this relationship actually looks like, than sort of worrying too much about that. We should probably start doing the same. Sure, maintain our teaching that the ideal is a union between a man and a woman, and teach that and encourage that wherever we can. But it's not the end of the world when other people don't follow it, because there's plenty of things that other people and that ourselves do that is against the Bible too. We just got to sort of work with that and work with the culture of forgiveness and the example that Jesus had. Jesus didn't come to save, like the doctor doesn't come to save, the doctor comes to the sick, not to those who are healthy, as Jesus said when he was accosted about meeting with the tax collectors and the sinners. So perhaps if we focused more on that, I think we'd be we'd be doing a lot more than we would sitting around arguing about homosexual marriage all day long. But anyway, that's just my opinion. Hopefully you've learnt a bit something about how the Bible presents this issue. See you later.